Welcome back. This is part B of the third week's course content overview. This is number 3B. I'm Roger Steele, the facilitator for the 6-week self-study asynchronous course. For participants in East Africa region of World Vision, the course runs from the 18th of March through the 26th of April. This part of the video is going to cover the content for two phases of the module, the setup phase and the planning phase. So the purpose is not to cover all of the content that is in the course. The participants are supposed to be getting that from the reading and the asynchronous videos, and this is just to provide some tips and some highlights and maybe a little bit on applications. So please watch this video with that in mind. This is again a reminder of what the phase model for the PMD Pro looks like. We are now in the second phase, project setup. The previous version of the PMD Pro guide called this the project initiation phase. We changed it because even though that's an accurate description for the industry, that the way that they study project management, but for the NGO and international development community, a lot of the initiation takes place earlier during the project identification and design phase. So it's now called project setup, which I think is a very accurate description. And you'll see that I've circled these little triangles, and you'll see more of them around the phase model. These are called decision gates, and those are extremely important. A decision gate is a place where you stop, you reflect, you make a decision about whether or not should continue on. And those are extremely important for control of the project as well. And I'll talk more about those, and you'll read about those in the guide. So let me start out with the setup phase and show you the question that we ask people in the face-to-face course when we're at this stage of the course. We say, why don't you just get on with the implementation? And we often have this motto in PMD Pro that we say, just do it, that we borrowed from the Nike company. Why don't you just do it? If you have the money in hand, why not start project implementation immediately? And I hope that in your reading and watching of the videos that you know the answer to this, so that it should be something that has become clear to you, that there needs to be a project setup or initiation set of activities in order to start correctly, in order to make sure that you don't encounter serious problems in the setup phase. So project setup is the process of describing and deciding to begin a project and authorizing the project manager to expend resources, effort, and money. So it's a lot like the beginning of a race. You have your official start, and everyone knows that you're starting the competition. So be sure that you pay attention to that. In the guide, you'll see an example of decision gates in the setup phase. There are decision gates, remember, in all of the phases. And they mention 4 gates: internal, initial internal, which is often in, at least in the case study that we used in the book concept paper, the initial external, which is the expression of interest, funding approval, which is the project proposal, and then formal authorization, which is what's called a project charter. That is probably a new document to most people. Now, these decision gates will be different for different organizations. These are just ones that happen to fit for the Delta River case study that you've been looking at in the guide. So a project charter, going back to that slide, is the formal authorization. And I want to spend some time on Project Charter because you may not have gotten all that you need to make sure that you understand the distinctives of it. Sorry, I'll get on the right slide here. The contents of a Project Charter can vary according to the organization, but it generally is a summarized document that provides a description, a short description of the project purpose, the deliverables, high-level project estimates and budgets, project risk, tolerances, and project change control. And it often lists that information, but it's a brief document. It's not the same as the proposal, or I think in World Vision you call it the project design document, or PDD. That tends to be a long, detailed document that is written according to the specifications of the donor or of the organization. The Project Charter is actually the document that's quite short, maybe only 2, 3, 4, or 5 pages, that actually gives the operating details, and it's a document that can be shared with others. It's not the same as a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding or the award letter. So just make sure that you understand those differences. Here's an example or a sample charter format, and there are many. This one I just got off the internet from the Harvard Business School Publishing. And this one actually has these categories of executive summary. It has the business case, and in the NGO community we probably would call that the objectives related to the needs that exist, the project definition, the risk assessment, and I'll talk a little bit more about risk, and then the project organization. So that's an example of a project charter. So I want you to make sure that you give that some thought and make sure that you understand the purpose of a project charter. Now, risk management then is one of those sections that comes in the project charter, but often organizations will develop a separate risk management strategy using a risk register. But I wanted to highlight this slide here because it's showing the grid of the hierarchy of objectives in the log frame and the indicators, the means of verification, and the assumptions. And I wanted to show you that the assumptions, especially this cell, which is sometimes called the crux across the most essential of the project log frame, because assumptions are the positive statements that are necessary to complete the logic. But almost every assumption can be turned into a negative and becomes a risk that should be managed. So that's one way of seeing a very practical use of the assumptions that you've got in your log frame, and that's a good starting point. So assumptions are not risk because assumptions are usually stated in the positive, and risk are usually negative. They are things that could happen in the future to impact your control of the project, just like you saw when you looked at the project triangle. So once you have identified your risk, then you need to then think about what type of response strategy do we want to have for managing this risk. And the PMD Pro guide mentions 4 of them: avoidance, transference, mitigation, and acceptance. So just make sure you're familiar with those. And then there's a tool that's called a risk register. Now the risk register can be done in many formats, like all of the PM tools. This one is what we call a quantifiable risk register. You could have one that has much more qualitative data, but basically you build yourself a grid, and then you, as the risk are identified, like I said, some of these will come by converting the assumptions from the log frame. You'll describe the risk. Then there are 2 variables that are often looked at to analyze risk. One is probability. What's the probability or likelihood that these risks will actually happen or come to life as the project is implemented. Many of them may not. And then there's a scale that's used. This happens to use a 10-point scale. You could use a 3-point or any 100-point, any kind of a scale you want. And then you give a score. In this case, 10 is the highest probability. 1 is the lowest probability of each risk. The other variable then is impact. What if this risk, these risks, were to actually happen, were to come true? What would be the negative impact, with 10 being the highest negative impact and 0 being the lowest negative impact? And then you can multiply those two numbers together to get a composite score. And if you do that for each of the risks in your register, it will help you to be able to determine the priority and which ones you want to give the most time toward in terms of management. And then, of course, providing an owner who will manage the strategies and actions that are listed here. You could actually have another column that could be what actually happened, because these are probably looking toward the future. So that's the risk register. Now I want to talk just a little bit about governance. And we could mention governance in conjunction with any of the phases, but we've mentioned it here because often the setup is when the governance body is usually formed. The idea here is that you want to have voices or perspectives heard throughout the implementation of your project. Participation, ownership is an extremely important concept in the NGO, international development community. And we generally then, in project management, talk about users, suppliers, and the executives. So just wanted to remind you to become familiar with those. And there also then are a couple of ways that this governance, it's not governance in the sense of government or politics, it has to do with the project specifically, that you could have a project board, which would be more than 2 people. And that's usually for more complex and larger projects. For simpler, smaller projects, you might just have one person who would perform the governance function, and that would be a project sponsor. So that's something, that distinction that's made. Okay, now I'm going to move into the next phase, and this is the planning phase, project planning. I sometimes call it detailed project planning because a lot of planning took place in the project identification and design, and it's hard to talk about the planning phase without also talking about implementation, but we've separated them just for learning purposes, and because you have this cycle of planning, implementation, replanning, implementation, and it goes around and around in an iterative process. It's also called a rolling wave process. I think somewhere else in the guide it calls this progressive elaboration. So those are some of the terms, and remember there are also decision gates that are here. A lot of the really critical tools come here, and this is where you'll be hearing about scope management and the work breakdown structure that relates to the assignment that I made in the previous module. I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again quickly. Pay attention to the 5 principles and the 6 disciplines. Even though we're using the phase model as the organizing structure for learning, these principles and disciplines are equally important, and they weave themselves throughout the different phases. I also wanted to have you look carefully at this graphic here. This actually shows phase interaction, that the phase model shows gives the impression perhaps that project management is somewhat linear, that you have one phase, you complete it, then you start another, when in reality there's a lot of overlap. So for example, you can see that this blue line is project implementation. Some organizations, and I know World Vision, when they're doing sponsorship, will actually start gathering child histories before they finish the design. And so they're actually doing implementation at the very beginning, but it's at a very low rate. So that shows, and it's done all the way up to the end. This one's an interesting one, transition. I would actually want to extend that line over here as well, because you need to be putting a transition plan in place as part of your design. So how you do these lines, it can be variable. So I hope you get the idea of what that graph is about. Please ask me in some format if you would like more information. We'd also like to emphasize how this question: how is a proposal different from a detailed implementation plan? And a detailed implementation plan is what you're actually using for implementation. Be sure that you know that there's a difference in all of these variables: purpose, format, detail, timing, schedule, participation, and requisite skills. That in general, a project proposal is a document that is done early and is intended to get funding and approval for project implementation, whereas the detailed implementation plan is the actual document and detail that will be used for implementation. This question should have an obvious answer. Is the scope as presented in the log frame comprehensive and detailed enough? And we're assuming that the log frame is part of the proposal or the PDD, and the answer is no. It's not detailed enough. That's why when you get to the planning, the detailed planning phase, you must provide more detail in order to be able to do a proper implementation. That detail then comes through scope, is through detailing the scope. And I wanted to point out that there are two types of scope. The distinction is made between two types of scope, and this can get a little bit confusing when you take the exam, so I just wanted to mention it. That product scope is the what. Those are the products and services that you'll produce. From the log frame itself, that's probably relates mostly to the outputs. And then the project scope is the how. How will you get to these end results? Those probably relate to the activities. So those are two types of scope, and when we say scope, we include both of those. Then there are 5 steps in the schedule planning process. The generic steps, and then there'll be those tools that go with each of them. Today, we're just going to talk about activity definition. Next week, you're going to be reading about activity sequencing, resource estimating, duration estimating, and schedule development. And the primary tool that's used for activity definition is the work breakdown structure, or WBS. And I'll talk about the other tools in the other schedule planning processes next week. So activity definition then is the work breakdown structure. And you need to be sure that you remember these two words, that you need to have a work breakdown structure that includes a comprehensive and detailed listing of all of the activities and tasks that are necessary to complete the work. And here's a statement that's called the 100% rule, that all of the work, both direct and indirect, needs to be done and listed in the work breakdown structure. Okay? And that word indirect and indirect is extremely important to understand, so be sure you know the distinction between those two. The direct work is the work that's done to actually bring about the outcomes and the results, the goal that you put into your proposal to bring about the social change, directly working with the beneficiaries, the partners who are involved in the project. The indirect work are the other things that need to be done in order to make sure that the direct work happens. And those would include the obvious things like procurement, like finance, information technology, security, human resources, those types of things. Those are extremely important but they're not detailed, they're not listed sufficiently in the proposal, which primarily deals with direct work. Okay, so the work breakdown structure has to have 100% of the work, including both the direct and the indirect. And in the last video, I've already talked about the work breakdown structure, and I actually showed you this actual example of filling a job vacancy, and you're going to be practicing doing a work breakdown structure as your activity for next week. So that's where I'm going to stop for today. That's, again, like I said, just a high-level overview of the topics that you'll be looking at. So feel free, and I encourage you to pass on any questions that you might have that I can help you with. So thank you very much. Have a good week.